Hello and welcome to another season of Finders Keepers, the podcast that helps you find the best keepers for your keeper and dynasty leagues. I'm your host Jordox, and I am super pumped to be back for another fantasy season in 2026. We're starting the preseason off with a bang, taking a look at the most important thing on keeper coaches' minds at this stage of the year. Who are the best 2025 draftees you should be targeting in your upcoming redrafts? To help us out, we have a very special guest for this episode. He joined MJ for a special rookie episode on the coaches panel last month, and he's with me now, draft expert Dylan Alexander. Welcome to Finders Keepers.
Thanks for having me, mate. Thanks for that little introduction there. I did join MJ, and the thing that I love about coming on these podcasts, particularly this early in the season, or at least this deep into the preseason, is this is proper footy nuffy territory here. The only people that are going to be listening to this is proper footy guys. So I'm loving that. And it'd be nice to connect with your community and looking forward to the pod. I always love chatting draft. I always love chatting footy. So this is going to be fun.
Awesome, mate. Yeah, absolutely. The fanatics are out in full force. It's early January and I think we are all frothing for some footy. So before we crack on, Dylan, thanks for joining. Just give us a bit of a history on, or a bit of an idea of your experience in the fantasy world. We spoke off air and about you haven't played a great deal in keeper leagues, but you've been playing fantasy for some time. What's your experience there like?
Yeah, to kind of, I guess, draw it back to a bit of a story. I was one of those kids back in the sort of early 2000s that was listening to podcasts like The Traders, who were kind of the first. I feel like they were probably one of the first ever YouTube videos or, content creation I ever saw way back in the early 2000s. And I was like one of those kids that would be walking around with I don't know if you remember those books called the Prospectus that used to kick around and have all the footy stats in, and it'd have stuff from who were going to be the best breakout contenders and stuff like that. So I'd be wandering around the place with that, or my mates would be into that kind of stuff. And we started playing fantasy football. I reckon it was about 2007, 2008, somewhere in that territory. It might have been a little bit before that, but it was back when you had those gun fantasy players like Dane Swan, Gary Ablett, these types of players. Dean Cox was the best ruck, Aaron Sandilands, these types of players. So it was very different back then. I think some of the numbers that were kicking around, the averages that players were putting up back then were absolutely massive. I think possession was a lot higher and stuff like that. So the game's evolved a lot over the time, but just something I've always liked. I've found that fantasy's always given dead rubber games that I wouldn't otherwise be interested in, a lot of meaning. So that's probably where it became exciting for me. And I'm not a big sports betting guy or gambling guy. So I think fantasy was probably the next best thing to give a little bit of jeopardy to those less important games for me.
I think that's a great way to look at it. It does. Fantasy's always been something that just makes you interested in the most boring games and gives you an understanding of players and teams that you would otherwise not. It's at the point where I genuinely don't understand how people follow footy and don't play fantasy. But yeah, again, we are in nuffy territories there. So that's good. So what we've got you to do, and we're going to do this a bit later, is I've got Dylan to have a look at the draftees from the 2025 class and come up with a top 10 list of the best keeper prospects. And he's going to run through that a bit later for us. Before we continue, just a quick little sneak preview of what's to come in the preseason for Finders Keepers. It's going to be quite similar to last year, this time 12 months ago when Finders Keepers got off the ground. Started by doing positional rankings. And what that is it's me taking a look at what I think are the players most likely to be available in your redrafts and ranking them by position based on all the different variables that will matter, whether it's someone you're looking for points on the field this year, someone who's going to develop into a star. I've considered everything and I've come up with my rankings for each position. So those episodes are going to drop every week starting from next week. And then as we approach the season, there'll be a few episodes on different things like trading strategies and similar things of that note. So, Dylan, in the last, I reckon, 4 or 5 years, we've seen maybe not a change, but we've seen a number of years where a player has come in, and typically it would take 4 to 5 years for a player to debut and become a fantasy jet. You think about some of the best ones you mentioned earlier, Gary Hablett Jr., for example. He was a good 5 years in, I reckon, before he got going. Swanee, and it's quite rare for a player. Clayton Oliver's probably the biggest one that sticks in my mind, who in his second season was a fantasy gun. But in the last few years, we've had some draftees roll through: Nick Dacos, Harry Sheasel, both the Ashcroft boys, who are pretty much just about fantasy guns in their second season. Do you think this is the new normal? Do you think that this is something we can continue to expect and I guess have expectations when we draft these guys? Or do you think I'm just talking about a handful of generational types and maybe it's going to stick to the usual formula of debut, incremental increases, maybe tread water, and then big breakout in years 4 or 5?
I think there's 2 parts to this. So to answer your question on do I think that is a trend? Absolutely, yes. And it's something that I've talked about extensively on my channel. I put it down to just the improvement in professionalism in things like the private school system. So a lot of these guys, particularly if they're based in that sort of Vic Metro area, if you look at those examples that you're giving, the Nick Dacoses, the Harry Sheasel, I think the next one that we're going to see, a player that we're going to probably talk about in this video a little bit too, Jagger Smith is another one like that. They all come from that fairly wealthy area of sort of the east, inner east of Melbourne and that sort of area. And they're attending some of the wealthiest private schools and things like that. And the coaching and the development that is going into all of that, as well as just the development of the Coates Talent League program as well, which is the feeder for the AFL, that sort of pathway program. I just think you're seeing a greater level of professionalism. You sort of juxtapose that next to the growth of the internet and the amount of information out there for players. Players are starting to be able to train more like professionals from the age of 15, 16 years of age. And then by the time they get to the AFL, they're just so much better equipped. All the information, all the training that they've done over those years leaves them in a really good place just to be ready to come and hit the ground running. So I think if you went back and looked, the further back you went, I reckon the less impact you'd have from players that were young in their first couple of seasons in the AFL. So I definitely think it is a trend. The only thing that I would say in looking at this draft pool that we're going to in 2025 is it's probably not the strongest draft class overall. So I'm not sure if we're going to have a Sheasel or a Dacos or even a Levi Ashcroft coming through in this draft. But I do think that is a trend overall, and we've still got a few gems that we can have a look at, particularly as the draft gets a little bit deeper too. I think there's some really good options further back in this draft, just given how the build of the draft kind of played out.
And that's why it's great to have you on, because, in recent years, the draft, keeper draft, it's been, I think back to the Dacos and Horne-Francis year. If you had a top 2 pick in your draft, you knew you were grabbing one of them. And last year was Jagger Smith, and it just feels like this year, like you said, that the draft isn't as strong, but that also means it's more balanced. So I guess what I'm saying is I think that if you're in a draft and you've got, say, pick 8, in previous years, it's like, well, who am I going to get? What gun kid am I going to get? But this seems like the sort of draft and the sort of year where you could pluck someone a little bit later and he ends up being the best of the lot. So it'll be good to, I'm going to be picking your brain shortly on who those guys are. But Dylan, what do you sort of look for when you're assessing the best kids for fantasy and I guess a keeper league? I mean, junior scoring, opportunity to play early, playing for a lower side, or the profile of the club that player has joined. there may be a need for that position of what that player is. I'm sure it's a mishmash of all of it, but what's your sort of process when you're looking at this side of things?
Yeah, I think there's an element of looking at the numbers and the statistical side of it, but there's also that feel and using the information that you got from going to the games and stuff like that, watching some of these guys. Obviously, the position comes into it a lot. Like if you're talking about someone that you want in a keeper league, you want them to be a 100 to 110 plus scorer, averaging in 3-4 years time. So they've got to have that ability to slide into the midfield. Obviously, you're going to have some guys that can play halfback. You're probably less looking at key position players and stuff like that. But overall, they've got to have some positional flexibility to be able to come into a team, fit into a new role, do all of those sorts of things. But I think when you're looking at top level fantasy players, it's really all about that balance of, do you have that inside game to you where you can go inside, you can win a stoppage and you can score from that source, but you've also got that transition football in you. You've got enough athleticism to get the ball on the outside and be damaging. I know being damaging by foot doesn't really come into fantasy perspectives, but if you want to be a guy that your team gives the ball, you've got to be that. And we've seen scorers like Errol Goulden, who's got a sniper of a left foot kick. Like those players can be massive fantasy scorers as well. But ultimately for me, the players that I'm going to look at to be able to score big in 5 years' time, they've got to have a really good football brain. They've got to know where to run. All their off-ball work has to be really, really good. But they've got to have that balance of inside and out. Can you go inside, win clearance, win your contested football, and get the ball on the outside?
Yeah, that flexibility is, probably the thing you see when these kids come through. I mean, I don't want to keep going back to Nick Dacos. He could be one of the greatest players of all time. So it's probably not a fair, yardstick. But
I think he's not to cut you off there, but he's a really, really good example because he had the positional flexibility to go straight to half back, right, where he could just win. I don't know what his exact uncontested mark numbers were, but he was probably flicking between 5 and 12 a game. But then as soon as he went into the midfield in sort of year 2 or 3, he can go straight in there and he was just a loose ball animal. He was pouncing on everything, winning clearances. And he went from a 20 kick 5 handball guy to a 15 and 15 guy, essentially, with his handball work as well. So that sort of flexibility and that inside-outside balance is ultimately what I'm looking for when I'm looking at the best of the best when it comes to fantasy.
And the beauty of that too, for keeper leagues, is you might get a season or two where they've got the dual position. So Dacos started off half back, therefore he had defender status for maybe the first 2 years of his career. Sheasel, he's been everywhere. He's had every position. So those players are very important because you know that down the track they're going to be mid only, and that's fine. But to get a year or two of as a forward or defender is it's just a bonus if they turn into Jets. Is there a player that surprised you in recent years that didn't have a lot of fanfare in the fantasy world, but we're looking at him now and he's a fantasy Jet? I mean, Sheasel's probably the only one I can think of with my limited knowledge of the kids before they debut. But I know there wasn't a huge talk about Sheasel as an accumulator as such. And my goodness, things he's doing at AFL level are incredible.
It's funny with Sheasel because if you look at him as a junior, he was pretty much played as a medium forward the entire time, and he kicked bags and bags of goals. During the season, though, and this is probably just the context that the average AFL fan needs to get coming into something like a keeper league season, he played a stint of about 4 or 5 games in the midfield for the Sandringham Dragons, and they were massive numbers. So when he did go into the midfield, he was getting between 30 and 40 touches in a junior game, which is actually shorter. So he could accumulate the football and he could show that. It's funny that when he actually came into the AFL, the position that he played was half back, and that was about the only position that he actually hadn't played for the Sandringham Dragons in that draft year. But when you get a player like that, where you can see the game awareness, the smarts, the IQ that they play with, they know where to go, the patterns that he runs to be able to find the ball, where he situates himself when his team doesn't have the ball, those sorts of things. That's pretty adaptable to being able to play any position on the ground straight away. And just I suppose Sheasel's always carried himself as well off the field with that sort of gravitas as well. He's got leadership from a young age, and you know that he's working really, really hard to be the best that he can be to be an AFL player. And I think that stuff is, as much as we're talking about fantasy here, that stuff's kind of important to understand how they're going to adapt to the AFL as well. So there's always signs there, I think. If I talk about players, like Sheezer would have been one for sure, because nobody would have thought being drafted as a medium forward that he would have got to the heights that he's got in his first couple of seasons. I probably always look at that. The player that I always write off maybe unfairly is that really, really inside mid type. Like I remember a couple of seasons ago saying like Matt Rowe's never going to make it as a fantasy player. Like he's not going to be someone that's regularly in people's teams. And he's probably proved me wrong a little bit. I think he's been able to get a little bit of a burst of pace into his game. He sort of explodes a bit from stoppage now, which he's added into his game, and he gets a bit more ball on the outside and stuff like that. And because of his physical nature and the way that he goes in after the ball and he tackles and stuff like that, brings that defensive part of his game, he does become a threat in fantasy as well. So it's probably that type of player, like the Matt Rowe, the Caleb Sarong, who's sort of able to, over time, they're sort of able to add pieces to their game and become a really threatening fantasy player. The other one that I had written down, and it's probably less of a fantasy thing and more of a footballing one, is Murphy Reid. I think he was probably the most impressive for me from that 2024 draft crop, just how he was able to adapt to playing different positions. And again, that comes back to that sort of the IQ part of his game, because he was always a really, really intelligent footballer, but not someone that I thought had great positional flexibility because of his lack of athleticism. But he knows where to go. He knows where to find the ball and impact. And he kind of makes up for his lack of running ability and his lack of pace with his smarts. And he did that for Freo so well. To play a high half forward role like that for Freo and pretty much become an integral part of that team by the end of the season, I think he was really, really surprising, albeit in a fantasy context, not exactly someone that people would have been picking up either.
Well, he's a great example of the guy that, we in the fantasy world, we talk about the eye test a lot. And what is that exactly? Because there are players that you watch and you see them do things on the field and you just go, oh, there's something in this kid. And it might not be now, it might not be this year. And I see it a bit, and, that's why I love, that's why I created this podcast. I love talking about what I see on the weekend, just these little glimpses, because often you'll watch a game, I watch a game and I'll see this kid and or it might not be a kid, might be an older guy who's breaking out, but you see someone and you think, oh, wow, this guy he's got it. And then you look at their fantasy score and it's like, never mind. He didn't do much at all. But it's those little, like you said, that IQ and that awareness that they have. And Murphy Reid's a great example. I know a guy, a mate in my league, who picked him up, and he was sitting on him all year thinking, I really want to keep him, but the scores just aren't there. And we have to delist a lot of players. So I can't remember if he held him or not. But, yeah, there's a bunch of those players. And if you can have the one that in a few years' time explodes, we'll all look back in hindsight and say, oh, gee, yeah, it was always going to happen. I remember his first year. He kicked 4 goals on debut down at Geelong.
100%. And that's that positional thing as well, isn't it, with a player? Like Murphy Reid absolutely passed the eye test and clearly passed the test from a footballing perspective. The coaches wanted him in the team all season and he became really, really important. But in a fantasy perspective, if you are playing that, if you're playing a small forward role or a high forward role, you just get starved, right? It's the same with the wingers. You could be the best player in the league, but if you're playing out there on a wing, it's going to be really, really difficult to score in fantasy. And that's where you need those different aspects to your game. So it's tough because you want to be versatile enough that when you're a young player, you can get into the team, because you're not going to walk into centre bounces from day dot unless you're really, really, really good. So you want that positional flexibility, but then you want to be able to have all of the attributes to be able to move into a midfield role in 3, 4, 5 years' time.
Yeah, and it's the score build too. You talked about Rao, and I was the same. I remember thinking he's just going to be a solid 90s guy,
Yep.
Because his score build was just so dependent on tackles, and he would not take a mark. His marking numbers were so low, but great to see him have that year, completely sidetracked from rookies. But on that, I want to pick your brain, just because I have had Jai Newcomb in my keeper side for a few years, and I'm getting so close to doing the same thing, thinking, nah, he's just a 90s guy. He's just tough as nails, inside mid. who is just never going to be, a 105 guy, for example. He's still young, though. What do you reckon? Do you reckon he can pop up this year and maybe not win the Brownlow convincingly, but,
probably not. But there's definitely some similarities there. And I love John Newcombe as a player as well. And I loved Matty Rowell as a player in his own way. What I think with Newcombe that's a little bit more nuanced there is I feel that Hawthorn's game style has a propensity to sort of bypass the midfield a little bit. Like they're a very, very heavy transition team. They almost in a lot of games, like there was a game back in, I think it was like round 1 or round 2 against the Bombers. And they essentially at around the ground stoppages, like they left a player, they pretty much went one man down at the stoppage, left a spare behind the ball. And that's pretty much how they want to play. They'll concede the clearance and then they'll start their chains from just a little bit behind centre and they'll flick the ball, they'll change angles, they'll use those kickers. They've got all those runners, athletic kickers like, Weddle and Scrimshaw and those kind of guys that can just get up and back down the field, run really hard, but also use their foot skills. D'Ambrosio is another one that just gets back into defence and he runs that wing. So I feel like it's partly with Hawthorn, it's their game plan where they don't really, like Newcomb's sole job, and they've got those kind of mids, don't they? They've got Newcombe, they've had Warple, they're in and under guys. They're guys that are going to load up on tackles. They're going to get their contested possessions and their inside numbers, but they're not necessarily going to fill the stat sheet. And I almost think that with them, unless you see a change in game style coming into the preseason where they want to adapt a little bit, which I don't think they are, because I think the game style works for them really well, playing that transition brand with the personnel that they have. So Newcombe might be a row for a little bit longer, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. And that's still fine. I mean, he's scoring all right. It's just, you're hoping he turns into a captain option. Anyway,
I feel like sorry to cut you off there again. I was going to say, I feel like it's very, for a player like Newcombe, it's game dependent. So if the matchup sort of works and there's a lot of ball, a lot of stoppages and stuff like that, he'll still fill the stat sheet and he'll get enough of a score. But if the game's actually on Hawthorn's, you see a lot of games where it's on Hawthorn's terms and they win the game convincingly and it's a big transition game. He actually doesn't score. So it's almost like if Hawthorn play the way they want to play, he's not scoring.
Yeah. So I'll continue to cheer against Hawthorn this year. That's good. Now, I could go through my entire keeper side and get your thoughts, but that's probably not what the listeners are interested in. They're very much interested in the rookies. Now, before we jump into your top 10, I'm just going to flip the run sheet a little bit. There's a question I had at the end, but I just wanted to pop it in now. Are there any names from last year's draft, so the 2024 draft, who didn't pop in 2025? Maybe they didn't play, or when they played, they were the sub, they didn't score. And they're just the sorts of guys that maybe we drafted them, and as the years rolled on, we've let them go, and they're now free for the redrafts coming up. One guy that pops up in my mind, and then I'll ask you if you've got any other nuggets for the listeners, like a Leo Lombard. I know there was a lot of talk about him, this time 12 months ago, and he would have gone fairly high in most redrafts. I'd say there's a good chance he's sitting in the pool and could be someone you could grab this year. So he's someone possibly. What do you think of Lombard, and are there any other names that stick out to you to keep an eye out for?
Yeah, Lombard is a good shout from you, actually. I didn't have that one written down, but that's a really good one. And he's a guy that's going to find it really difficult to break into this Gold Coast midfield in the short term. I mean, they're just absolutely stacked with talent, aren't they? And they've brought in Zeke Ewell, Dylan Patterson as well, who are probably slightly more positionally flexible than someone like a Leo Lombard. He's really at this point probably waiting for a player like Tuke Miller to retire so he can kind of slide in there. We've had Flanders leave the club, so that probably opens up one potential spot. But there's still guys like Jake Rogers kicking around, and that's really what's holding him back. But Lombard, I think, in a best case scenario, he could be in 5 or 6 years' time, if he can break into that midfield and get a genuine spot in there. He sort of could be the next Tuke Miller for them with his athletic profile. He's got elite speed, he's got elite endurance, he's someone that takes the game on. He always performed really well from a numbers perspective as a junior as well. He was a joint Lark medalist in that 2024 draft. So probably slid slightly in the end. I think he was pick 8 in the end, but I sort of had him in more around that top 5, just with his qualities, like his pace and his ability to break a tackle and then sort of slip forward as well. So, yeah, a lot of comparisons there to Tuke Miller. He would be a great one. The other one that's just a sort of, a tap-in type one is Jagger Smith. Had the knee injury last year. We haven't seen him yet, but he's kind of, when you talk about having inside-outside qualities and Dacos-like features, the way that he can sort of navigate, contort his body to get out of tackles at stoppages, he was clearly the best player in that draft at being able to sort of pounce on loose balls from sharking ruck contests and stuff like that. So he can win the ball at source. I think he's not as good of a user of the ball as someone like a Nick Dacos, so he's not going to be set up as that playmaker. And when he first comes into the Carlton team, I think he's more likely to have to play midfield than a Dacos did, who could sort of float across halfback and dictate. Midfielders playing in their first season of AFL typically don't score, they don't average 90 or 100. And even Dacos, who was absolutely brilliant and playing in a really fantasy-friendly role across halfback, didn't even average that much. So he'll be one of the big ones, though. I'd say 75 would be the floor for someone like a Jagger Smith coming into that Carlton midfield. And where they're at, too, as a club, I think that's sort of a match made in heaven where they're sort of rebuilding. They're going to have the Cripps and the Hewitts in there to help him. And then he's going to be there as that sort of third or fourth banana behind Walsh, Chera, those kind of players. So I think they'll let him dip his toes in the water a little bit. There could be some wing, there could be some halfback, but I think he's just an absolute magnet. He had 50 touches in a game at junior level. He had a couple of 40s as well. So he was someone that just consistently found the ball. He's clean, creative, and just everything that you want in a sort of all-round midfielder.
That would be music to the ears of many coaches listening, because he would have gone pick 1 in most redrafts this time last season with Ashcroft, him and Ashcroft 1 and 2. And then the ACL came. And I've never seen a player's reputation build for 12 months without seeing them play. So there's a lot of expectation on the young man, but he'd be owned in pretty much every single league there is. So, yeah, it's an exciting time for Jagger Smith owners who have sat for 12 months, and they can start the countdown to Carlton Richmond round 1, because I'm sure, all going well, he'll be there. With the guys who didn't pop, though, another one I was thinking of that went pretty early in drafts but didn't get a lot. He played, he just didn't show a lot. What was your take on a Toby Travalia for St Kilda? There's a lot of hype around him, and he played, and I thought he played well enough, just didn't really get the fantasy guys going.
Yeah, an interesting one, because he's one of those guys that comes in and very, very skinny entering the league. So you never know how they're going to go. Usually with players like Travalia, I did have a little higher expectation on him just because of his running ability. He's an elite 2K time trial guy. So I thought with that running ability, he might be able to kind of, drift into pockets of space. He's playing across halfback generally, so he's going to be able to rack up the ball. But he did play a lot of wing for the Saints. And he was, to be fair on him, I think he was kind of subbed into most games. So he probably didn't get to show himself throughout. I think some of these guys coming on as a sub when they're young, it kind of hurts their confidence a little bit. They're used to being the best player in their team. They step into an AFL environment, and that's, I think, sometimes difficult for them. So it was slightly underwhelming, but I think definitely there's a fantasy player in Toby Travalia. I think he was, for the Bendigo Pioneers, he was one of the best sort of intercept players, a guy that could kind of step into midfield as well. So he's got that sort of ground level ability of an inside mid, but tall enough that he can play behind the ball. There's a lot of Will Day similarities about him, and we know how those skinnier, leaner type players, they can take 2, 3, 4 years to kind of come into their best. And I think Toby Travalia will be one of those guys. He's got all the attributes to be able to be an awesome AFL player.
And there will be some who gave up and let him go. And if he's in your pools, in your upcoming redrafts, you heard it here. He's someone to target for sure. All right, Dylan, I think we've kept them waiting long enough. I'm excited for this list. I'm going to get my little notebook out and pen and paper, get ready, because I've got pick 2 in one of my drafts, and I've got pick 7 in my other keeper draft. So let's hear it. Your top 10, you can start at 10 and work your way up.
All right. I've got a couple of, can I throw a couple of near misses at you?
Yes, please. I was going to ask you at the end. Give us a few.
Yeah, so names. I've got, and there might be some here that are more prominent for you, and you might want to ask me about with the misses. So going from maybe the most relevant here, I think Cooper Duff-Tytler is one that potentially people would have in and amongst the 10. He is a ruckman, and I know ruckman have sort of emerged as kind of the best scorers in the game now. So I think there is a chance that if he did become that dominant style ruckman, and he's a guy that is very high volume as a ruck, that he would have been sort of in and around it. I've got Sullivan Roby, who didn't quite make the top 10 for me. Jevon Philippou is one that I considered amongst the top 10. Harry Kyle, another one that I considered. Sam Swadling, who was a much later draftee, but someone that's always found the footy. I considered him, but didn't quite make the top 10. Jack Dalton, who was really high in my regular fantasy list with MJ a few weeks ago. And Sam Allen at the West Coast Eagles was another one I considered in the top 10, but none of those quite made it. So I thought I'd throw that out there to see if you had any questions about any of those guys.
Well, I've heard Roby's name a bit, so I am surprised he's there. But I want to ask you about the ruckman because, rucks, they're such an interesting part of keeper leagues. And it obviously varies from keepers. Some have huge lists that you can keep, like a dynasty league where you keep pretty much your whole list. And then there's some where, if they're not performing now, and you can't stash them all. So with rucks, they take so long to develop typically that that one you mentioned, what's his name with the hyphen?
Duff-Tytler.
Yes, that one. I heard some comparisons to a Luke Jackson possibly. So he's probably someone that in leagues where you're not keeping a bunch and you've already got a decent young ruck, he may not be one to target. But if you've got a league that, you can keep players for years and years and years until they pop, he's probably the best young ruck we've seen coming through for a few years. Would that be fair to say?
Absolutely, yeah. He's definitely the highest rated one as far as where he went in the draft. I think the issue is, and his similarities to Jackson are mostly around the fact that he's kind of an extra midfielder with the way that he plays. Like for Calder Cannons at times during the season, he was actually lining up at centre bounces as a mid, not even in the ruck. So they had like a second guy that would come in and then he would be that extra midfielder. He's so athletic. He ran the 20-metre sprint in about a 2.9 and he did the 2K time trial in, 6 minutes 10. So he's sort of elite in endurance, elite in speed, and he plays like a midfielder at 200 centimetres. The question would be, though, does he end up actually being a proper ruck? Like at AFL level, I don't think he's going to be able to be that midfielder like we see Luke Jackson do at times, but he's not a full-time midfielder. Is he a forward? Is he a ruck? What's his exact position? And I think there's enough ambiguity there that he doesn't quite make it, and you wouldn't want to waste one of your top picks, I suppose, in a keeper league on somebody like that. So that's why I left him out, but he could well be that guy.
Yeah. And Roby, just quickly, just not quite there.
Roby's an interesting one. Again, it probably fell down to the position for me. He's had some injuries early in the preseason, which I think are a little bit of a red flag on his whole development arc, because he was a player that grew a lot in a short space of time. He put on a lot of muscle and a lot of weight in a short period of time to become a bigger, more dominant player, an inside midfielder, which I think is a really good storyline. And there's some real success stories of players like that. But the injuries are a little bit of a concern for me with how he sort of starts off in this team and hits the ground running with stress fractures and stuff like that, with kind of potentially over-preparing and over-hitting the gym in his draft year to become that. The other thing is that position, and he's kind of a forward mid. He's probably a player in a similar vein to someone like a Jordan De Goey. So there's mixed things on that. Is he going to be like a Dustin Martin type who has had some really good fantasy seasons, but they're probably flash in the pan? Jordan De Goey's probably never put together an amazing fantasy season. There's always that little bit of inconsistency, and I think there's a potential that Roby is that type of player where he's a big game player. He kicks big goals at big moments and I know he's gone to Essendon, so it's hard to say he's going to have big finals games, but have those, be a big moments player, but not necessarily have the consistency of the best mids in the competition when we're talking fantasy.
Yeah, so those players interest me because they're the ones that don't get going early, the first few years. They show bits and pieces, and they're the ones that traditionally years 4, 5, 6, even 7 is when they explode. And there's so many great examples of them over the years, like Dangerfield, Dustin Martin, and Nat Fife started as a forward. Bont even took a bit. He was always a super coach guy. It took him a while to be a consistent fantasy guy. So maybe that's Roby. Maybe he's a bit further down the track. But certainly, I think you'd agree he's going to be a good chance at opportunities. The Bombers, they went through their whole list last year, and hopefully for them, their injuries are nowhere near that. But I think they're at a point where they're looking at everything they've got.
100%. There'll be opportunities for him for sure. I'll get stuck in then. So number 10, I have gone for Sam Grill from the Oakley Chargers and Vic Metro. So this guy was taken with one of Richmond's top picks. I'm actually struggling to recall the exact number that it was. I guess it would have been 7 or 8 in the end after the academy bids.
It was early and it was a surprise. Yeah, it was one of the first big surprises of the night because there were a few.
He was. I mean, Richmond had been eyeing this guy off, and Richmond really hit the draft coming in with a need for speed, and they got that with Sam Cumming and Sam Grill at the top end of the draft. And I think with this guy, he doesn't have enormous numbers at underage level. He was around, for Vic Metro, he was around the 20 disposal mark, and he was the same at the Oakley Chargers. He played more of a half-back dominant role at the top level at national champs, and then he played more as an inside mid for the Oakley Chargers as he went down. I see him as a guy that's going to start either on a wing and give Richmond that run and that speed, or he'll start at halfback running the ball and being a sort of a distributor for them. But I think in time you're going to see him come into the midfield and be that really fast-footed sort of explosive mid. A little bit similar. He reminds me with the way that he moves and steps out of traffic and around players like Zach Butters, and he attacks the football like Zach Butters as well. And that's more of what he looked like for the Oakley Chargers, where at national champs he was more of that sort of run and gun halfback, something like a Lockie Ash or an Asaya Wanganeen Miller. He's a little bit different build to an Asaya Wanganeen Miller, but that type of player. So he's a guy that's really good with the football. He's very athletic and can use that to sort of get in and around players. And he starts this off, and I think just his quality, and a part of it is his mentality and his competitiveness, because I really love that about him. And I think with all the attributes, the speed that I mentioned, how well he fits into that Richmond team, that's going to hold him in good stead to get games. And that sort of, I suppose, the growth to be someone like a Zach Butters and play that inside midfield role gives him a footing in AFL fantasy to be a top player.
Some pretty good names you reeled off when comparing him. So, Butters and, I mean, do you see him sort of, because they've got Banks at halfback, and I think he was a revelation last year. Jaden Short's getting closer to the end, and he found himself up on the wing at times as well. So do you see him maybe starting in that halfback role and then eventually becoming the mid, or do you think they'll look at just giving him a crack? Because they do have, obviously, Taranto, Hopper, and Prestia when he's fit. I really like Kane McAuliffe too. But I think they're at a point where they can just have a look at these kids in the middle, and maybe he'll get a go earlier. Do you think that's possible with him?
I don't expect him to have centre bounce minutes in year one.
Yep.
That's for sure. I think that's going to be down to more of those 2024 draftees. I think you're going to see Sam Lawler step into the midfield a little bit more. Clearly, they're going to try to get some minutes into Josh Smiley as well, who didn't play a game in 2025. The other one's Taj Houghton, who's that sort of crafty half-forward type, who I see being more of a dominant half-forward player that comes into the midfield occasionally, but I do think they are going to try and get minutes into him as well. If you look at those more experienced players that you mentioned, there's a lot more of a contested ball element to a lot of those guys than the outside skills. So I think that's what they really did this year with targeting those players. So Grill's going to be important to them with the pace that he provides. I think it's going to be a combination of wing and halfback. And you often see this. I think Xavier Lindsay, Finn O'Sullivan both sort of did it last year as well, where they start off a wing and there's a time where they get a little bit tired and they want to get a little bit more ball into their hands, and then they kind of flick them across halfback. It's a little bit easier back there. They don't have to deal with the physicality of and also being starved of the football like you get on a wing at times. So I think that is Grill at the beginning, and he wasn't in, for my fantasy, like regular season fantasy, he wasn't in my top 10 for that. I think he is going to be a slower burn. And if you have a look at a player like Zach Butters' numbers, who he is a slightly different player. Like Butters was more of that kind of forward mid when he stepped into the game initially, but I reckon his fantasy numbers for the first 2 to 3 years would have been somewhere between starting at sort of like 50 points a season, 60 points a season, and then he probably went to 80, something like that in year 3. And I think you might see something similar from a player like Sam Grill, who sort of has multiple positions before getting that kind of, final form when he steps into the midfield.
So that's pick 10, not pick 10. That's your 10. Number 10. What about number 9?
Number 9, and this one might confuse people because on that MJ episode as well, I mentioned that this guy could have been a really good player for Keeper League because he's one of my favourites in this draft. He probably, and this goes back to that thing that I was saying earlier with the Matty Rao type player, he leans a little bit too much on the contested ball side for me to actually ultimately put him right at the top end. And I think there's some players ahead of him that are more fantasy relevant, but I think this guy could be one of the best players in this draft. I'm talking Sam Cumming from South Australia here. He's going to be a slow burn. He's an ultimate contested footy, this guy. Like in at the clearances, he's just an absolute animal. Think about Rao, think about Wardlaw, that type of player that's just absolute, no regard for their own safety, head down, going hard at the ball. So he's going to have those big moments. He's going to have tackles and stuff like that around the ball. What he offers outside of that...
Richmond?
He's at Richmond too, yeah. So he was taking the pick before Sam Grill. So I think that was 7 and 8 in the end after the bids.
Yeah.
Memory not serving me too well there, but it was about that. So
right.
A top draft pick going to Richmond again, where you're going to see a player there that's going to get opportunity, a young side. All of these draftees that have come through, they've given them plenty of opportunity and there's spots there for them. So he's going to get a good induction to the AFL. What I think he offers on top of that contested ball winning on the inside that I mentioned with a player like Matty Rao and George Wardlaw, he's a bit taller. So he sits around the 188 centimetre mark. So he can play that medium forward role as well. So he can roll forward and he can take big marks. And there's a little bit of Isaac Heaney about him. So he's kind of that mid forward, floats around different positions. At the moment, I don't think he's a good enough runner to be able to get the uncontested ball that you need to be a really good fantasy player. If he can add that though, look out. And then you're looking at that Heaney type prototype. But again, to make that Heaney comparison, Heaney probably didn't come into a fantasy player. Like he would have been a really late breakout player as a real fantasy gun. I think he was probably 27, 28 when he actually became like a 100 averaging player in AFL fantasy, if I'm not wrong.
And that was more... I think that was more to do with when Sydney finally released him into the midfield. I mean, fantasy fans and possibly Swans fans were calling for that for years, but they liked him forward. And then finally he did get that full-time mid gig and he became a gun. And that was quite later. So, so it could be something similar for Cumming. So we've started with a couple of Tigers taken in the first round. Who's at number 8?
Number 8 is Josh Lindsay at the West Coast Eagles. Now, this guy is fairly well known now as probably the best kick in the draft. He slid in the end to pick 19, I think it was, where the West Coast Eagles snapped him up. He's just your ultimate halfback distributor. And I think the reason that he slid in draft standings was maybe that lack of positional flexibility and that he is just a designated kicker. I think... looking at the kind of the archetype that he is, it's probably someone like a Matt Suckling that used to play back in the day for the Hawks, Grant Birchall, that type of player where they're sort of a halfback flanker, not a huge amount of athleticism, but a guy that can just find a target in the center of the ground, really change the angles from halfback, hit those targets through the corridor and set up plays, set up scores. So that's Josh Lindsay. When you look at that West Coast Eagles team, that's very, very inexperienced at the moment. Certainly two of the biggest target areas of that team that need improvement are the contested ball winning, the clearance winning in the middle of the ground, but also being able to control the ball from the back half has been a massive lack for them. So I think he hits the ground running. I think he'll be one of the better early scorers of all players. And I think he'll just be one of those guys that when you're talking defenders who I suppose the scoring overall in AFL fantasy has risen a lot in recent years for those halfback flankers, but I think you're looking at a consistent floor of 85 from a guy like Josh Lindsay, a really smart footballer. And I talked about that with some of the players that have done really well from the get-go. Xavier Lindsay was a little bit like that last year for me as a player that could come in and hit the ground running as a halfback. We talked about Sheezel, we talked about Dacos who played that role. So Josh Lindsay's maybe a sort of version of that coming into 2026. I don't think he's got, from a keeper league perspective, he doesn't have the midfield capability of someone like a Dacos or a Sheezel, that type of player. But just really good at that one specific thing. Maybe a little one-dimensional in that aspect, but I think he's going to be a solid fantasy scorer for the next 10 years.
Well, the beauty of it is, if he's going to be a defender, and that's always going to be what he is, he'll always have the defender status. And, we do love the mids, but there's a place for those high-scoring defenders. And, West Coast, I think pretty much since Shannon Hearn finally retired, just haven't really been able to fill that gap. They've tried things. I thought Alex Witherden was going to happen. He didn't come on. And then last year we saw guys like Ryan Marrick. We've seen Brady Hoff tried there. So potentially Lindsay comes in and makes it his own right from the start. Yeah,
and he will be a bit of that. I mean, all of those players that you mentioned, like the Marrick type players, they're all sort of shoehorned in from another position, right? Like he was more of that third tall that went behind the ball because he could kick the footy, but Lindsay's just sort of been playing there season after season. I saw him win a best on ground medal at the Futures game on grand final day, sort of, pushing 18 months now. And then he was just playing that same position time after time. He's metronomic from back there. So he's going to be great. So the next one I've got is number 7. And I have gone with here, one of the Gold Coast Academy players. I've gone with Dylan Patterson, who's a little pocket rocket. He's another halfback flanker, very different to Josh Lindsay, though. He's someone that's more explosive off the back half, more likely to take the ball and run at you, step around players, open things up, and then use his foot skills. But what I think Patterson brings on top of somebody like Josh Lindsay is a little bit more athleticism, a little bit more possibility to be able to step into the midfield long term. And I think going into that Gold Coast team, he's probably still a player that could get games back there relatively early. I know they've got Rioli, they've got Noble, they've probably got a player like Will Powell, but he brings them something a little bit different just with his athletic profile and his explosive agility, the way that he can step around players. He was one of my favourite players to watch in this crop overall. So I think he's going to be a really good one. And on a pure talent level, looking at this entire crop, I think he's very safe from that regard.
And another defender too.
Another defender. Yeah, I think there is potential that he ends up playing some midfield and could even play in the forward half of the ground as well. But he'll definitely start as a defender. Absolutely. And I think he'll have that for at least the first sort of 3 to 4 years of his career.
He's got that advantage as well because that Gold Coast midfield, as you said earlier, it's going to be very hard to find a spot there if you're just joining the club. What about number 6?
Number 6, and this was a player that came in for the episode again with MJ where we rated the best open fantasy players. I had this guy at number 1, and this is Lockie Carmichael, who went to the Western Bulldogs around the pick 20 mark in the end, but they did trade up to get him. And I think the Western Bulldogs have really been crying out for a player like this. He's another metronomic dictator of the football across half-back. There are similarities there with Josh Lindsay, a very high IQ player. He drifts into pockets of space. He's always able to find uncontested football. At the National Championships, he averaged 27 disposals and he averaged a tick over 30, I think it was, in the regular Coates League as well. So he's a guy that just clearly knows how to find the football. He doesn't, again, and it's probably similar to that Sheasel model where like he doesn't look super impressive, but he just seems to be able to find the ball and just dictate. And what I said about the Western Bulldogs, they have halfback flankers. They've got their Bailey Dales, those really aggressive ball users, the ones that drive their legs, take a lot of meters, but they don't necessarily have just consistent kickers back there that can hang on to the football. I think one of the more impressive things we saw with that Brisbane team this year is the modes that they could sort of slip into. They could go from really, really fast offensive football. They could also just hang on to the football and defend with the football a little bit as well. And I think we've seen Western Bulldogs struggle with that. That's why we've seen them being scored so heavily against at different times in the last 2 to 3 years, really. They don't have guys that can just kind of shift into a different gear, not play that bullet a gate football. They can sort of slow things down, hang on to the ball. And I think Lockie Carmichael is someone that's going to be able to do that really, really well for them. So there's a place in the team for him. He can take one of those roles that players like Lockie Bramble have been taking. Oscar Baker's another one that's got games back there. He fits in there straight away and is going to get ball from the get-go.
It's come across as well, I reckon, to play maybe a similar role. So could be competing with him.
I'd missed that, but you said Buderick, I assume?
Yeah, Buderick from the Suns has come across to play. Yeah. Similar role. All right, I like that one. What about number 5?
Number 5, I have got a bomber here in Jacob Farrow. I've talked to you strongly, and if we could sort of break these players up into more of your slow burn players versus you guys that are going to come in and hit the ground running. I talked about Carmichael. I think there's a place for him to go in and play well straight away. Jacob Farrow for me is a little bit more of a slow burn. He's one of those bigger bodied midfielders, around 190 centimetres. So he's a guy that can go into the clearance and take a lot of punishment. He's got good reach in there with his longer limbs. But he's also a guy that can get the footy on the outside. He can be that sort of intercept defender as well. So I think he'll start for the Bombers probably across half back, be a bit of a distributor back there for them, someone that can pinch hit with the intercepting, win the ball back off the opposition, and then use his athleticism to get forward. He's a very, very versatile player, someone that kicks the football really well. He took kick-ins for WA across the season, took kick-ins for his native team back in Perth as well, but he also played midfield there as well. So he can kind of go in, win a big clearance with his strength, but also distribute from the back half. So another one of those high IQ players that I think is really important when you consider fantasy, the guys that are good off the ball, they can drift into those pockets. And Farrow is definitely another one of those. He was a high draft pick for a reason. Essendon wanted to get their hands on him. And that team, as you mentioned earlier in the video, so many injuries. They've tried so many new players. They really want to rebuild this midfield over the next 3 to 4 years. And I think Farrow is going to be a big part of that.
Oh, that's exciting. I mean, I remember hearing about him and that half-back sort of role and thinking Jordan Ridley, just can't stay in the park and that they need someone else to come through there. But you reckon he'll start there and then move to the midfield down the track?
I think his best player comparison, if you want to look at a player and their development across multiple seasons, is Jordan Dawson. So that intercept type defender. Yeah, exactly. I mean, Dawson, what was Dawson doing at Sydney? More of a wing role, really? And then he came across to Adelaide. I remember picking him up straight off that first season in Adelaide in regular fantasy, and he was playing more of an intercept defensive role, but clearly someone that they wanted to get the ball into his hands as well. So he was distributor/interceptor. And then when he played that game against Carlton, I reckon it was 2024, around gather round, went straight into the midfield and just went bang, added those tackles into his game, winning big clearances. I think that is the trajectory for a player like Farrow. Another one that he's similar to is Hayden Young. That guy that's good enough at ground level to play midfield and good enough in the air to intercept behind the ball. Very good. What about number 4? I've got his teammate. And this one's a bit of a safe one. I think there's probably no more polarising player in the 2025 draft than Dyson Sharp from South Australia. Some people absolutely loved him and some people absolutely hated him. I even flip-flopped a little bit throughout the year with him. He's an interesting one. He's a very, very inside midfielder. We talked about those guys. We talked about the Matty Rows, the Caleb Sarongs. Clearly, if you want like a perfect balance of a player, you probably want that more like Bontempelli type, right? Who can have huge clearance numbers but also be a massive threat on the outside, have that height to be able to take marks and sort of do everything. Jordan Dawson's another one like that as well. Dyson Sharp is probably, if I was going to compare him to somebody currently in the AFL, it's something between a Tom Green at the top end as that first possession type player, that inside type midfielder. And then if you're looking maybe glass half full a little bit more, it's probably someone like a James Worpel. And that's kind of where he's been seen and where the polarization sits around Dyson Sharp. He's not the most aesthetic player. He's not smooth moving. He's a little bit, sort of Inspector Gadget, running, got a bit of an awkward gait, a bit of an awkward running style, but he's very, very effective. He was one of the highest disposal winners across the national champs. He won the Lark medal. He's really been, across this particular draft crop, he's been the best performed player for, we're talking sort of 2, 3, 4 years. And when all of the other junior players were asked at the beginning of the season who they thought was going to go as the number 1 pick, they almost all unequivocally said Dyson Sharp. That's how highly they rated him playing against him. But he is a little bit more of that unfashionable old school midfielder to a recruiter. So he's not, when you look at the prototypes and you look about players, everybody wants the next, Finn Callahan, they want the next Bontempelli, that type of player. Dyson Sharp's a little bit more of your old school contested side of the game. And we know that most of the scoring happens from transition football. So for that reason, he's probably not as, idolised in this sense. But I think the numbers kind of speak for themselves. And every time Dyson Sharp's had to step up to another level, he's always kind of gone to it and reached it. So I really like him. I've got him here at number 4, which is, I don't know, somewhere in between, I suppose, for me. But I just think the floor is so high on someone like a Dyson Sharp that he's going to be a safe top-end pick.
We're playing probably from the get-go, yeah?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I
remember he slid on draft night and he just kept on every pick. It was like still. And I was getting excited. I'm a Crows man. I kept thinking, oh, is he going to slide all the way to us? And because he's exactly what the Crows need. But no, Bombers got their man. And, yeah, I think he's going to be a beauty. Down to our top 3. Who's at 3?
Yeah, we're getting into the big guns now. So I have gone here with Willem Dersma, who was the number 1 pick overall in the draft. He's gone to the West Coast Eagles. And I'm not sure how to attack this one in explaining it, because I suppose some people will think, well, he was the number 1 pick. Why isn't he going to be the number 1 fantasy scorer? I think with a player like Dersma, with the attributes that he has and the versatility that he has, I'm probably holding that against him slightly here. I think it's a lot to expect that a player like Dersma, who's sort of a skinny halfback flanker come midfielder around 190 centimetres, is going to be the next Bontempelli. Obviously, that's the hope for West Coast fans, but you never really know if that's going to happen. And not a lot of these kind of skinny utility types don't reach the heights, particularly from a fantasy perspective. So I think there's every chance, he's somewhere between that sort of, lanky halfback flanker that becomes a midfielder like Will Day. Bontempelli was another one that kind of started his career, or at least played his junior football as a halfback flanker before stepping into the midfield. So I think Dersma will take some time. If this works in a best case scenario for West Coast Eagles, I think you've still got a really, really top end scorer. And that's why I've got him at number 3. I rate him really highly. I mean, this guy has all of the attributes to be a gun AFL player, to be that height, to have that reach, to have the skill, to have the speed. Everything that he has got is a modern AFL player. He can go forward, kick goals, float across halfback. There's just so much to him. It's hard to actually conceptualize everything that's Willem Dersma, but he fits in at 3 here. He's behind a couple of absolute big guns that you probably, people are probably starting to understand who they are now. I'd still have him above that sort of consistent Dyson Sharp inside guy for what he can bring on the outside. I've got him in the end, ultimately at 3.
Yeah, maybe a bit of a surprise for some, but yeah, I think most are going to know who the 2 are. So who comes in as your second best prospect?
Zeke Uland is number 2, and he's just Zeke Uland's a funny one, like just a really, really good footballer. Someone that kicks the ball a little bit similar to an Errol Goulden. He's got physicality. He can go on the inside. He's super versatile to play across different lines. And I said before, we kind of talked about the players that could come in and hit the ground running straight away. And I mentioned modern players and young players that just seem to lock in now. They can, find things on the internet. Zeke Uland did come from that Gold Coast Academy, which obviously helps a lot as well with these young players that are coming straight into the AFL. They get to work a lot in AFL environments, AFL systems. So he's had that sort of clear path into an AFL system. He's got his brother that's already in the AFL as well. So the work rate and the professionalism, the inside-outside nature to his game, the fact that he can go inside and win the ball on the outside, play multiple positions, just makes him too good to look to kind of overpass here, I think. So if you've got a top pick in Keeper League, you've really got to be considering, and I think you mentioned before that you had pick 2. Yeah, you'd have to be considering this guy with one of your top picks.
Yeah. Where does he fit in for this season in terms of, I guess, A, does he get games early, and B, how long before we see him really exploding and in his element in the midfield? Because that
for this season, I think he's straight into that Fiorini wing role.
Okay, that's pretty good.
With him being vacated, because this guy can play anywhere. You could play him as a small forward, you could play him as a halfback, you could play him as a wing, you could play him as a mid. I think expectation around him exploding, I think it would be relatively safe to say you'd expect it from a player like Zeke Uland in the first 3 years. I don't think he's got major elements. He was probably one of the more well-rounded players across the draft. So it's not like he has a ton of stuff that he has to work on, and he's pretty ready to go. He's played VFL football and had sort of, between 15 and 25 touches, which is usually a good sign that you kind of, you're ready to play against men and stuff like that. He doesn't look like he's overawed by the physicality, and also has AFL attributes on top of that. So I think he's going to hit the ground running early, and he's going to be a pretty big scorer from that sort of second, third year. You can kind of expect big scoring. So that's why I've got him up the top end, and there's only one to go.
He's number one. Who we got?
Could you guess it from this?
Oh, I was hoping it'd be one of the Crows forwards that we plucked, but I'm guessing it's probably not.
It's Archie Ludo. No, it's not. It is Dan Annable. It is Dan Annable. Yep. I think from what we talked about at the start of this video we talked about Dacos, we talked about Sheasel, we talked about Jagger Smith as well as those junior footballers that have all of the smarts to make it in the AFL level. They've got the junior numbers as well. You have that tick list in front. Does he have the IQ to make it at AFL level? Does he have the inside-outside balance? Dan Annable has all of this. He's got the scoring pedigree already. He would have been, without actually having the numbers in front of me right now, he would have been the top scorer consistently across a large number of games at the Champs, at the Coates Talent League level, at the VFL when he played there as well. He's one of those guys that stepped in for the Brisbane Lions VFL team and just hit the ground running like Ashcroft did a year earlier. He's just another one that the Brisbane Lions can add in. And the only thing that you would hold against Dan Annable with the balance that he has and the ready-made nature that he has to play as a fantasy player would be the position in that Brisbane team. Like, how do you get into that team right now? There's obviously some rumours around Lachie Neale, like whether he's going to end up going back to Perth or something like that. That's probably not going to happen until at least another 12 months' time. So it's difficult to predict these things, but that would be the only question mark that I would have on Dan Annable, how quickly he can get into this team. I wouldn't say, and I would have said the same thing about Levi Ashcroft 12 months ago, he's not a particularly flexible player. I don't think he's someone that could go across half back. He doesn't quite have the foot skills for something like that. He's a good decision maker, but he's not a surgical kick like somebody like Ezekiel Uland is. So maybe a half forward flank, maybe he could fit onto a wing, but they are starting to kind of, Brisbane, that team, they're starting to build a lot of these kind of, they're great players, but they're all sort of inside midfield type players that they've brought in the last few years, like Will Ashcroft, Levi Ashcroft, Dan Annable, Sam Marshall was another one that they got through the academy last year. So a lot of the same types and a lot of players that he has to jump ahead of to get in the team, but he is just so good as that inside type midfielder that can also win the ball on the outside.
I think the best thing for his prospects for a keeper league is quite often the number one or, one of the number one picks will go to the bottom side, and they often play round one. Yeah. And there's that expectation and that pressure. I mean, this guy's walking into the back-to-back premiership winners, Brisbane. There's no rush to play him. I know the fans are going to want to see him. They're not going to rush him. He can spend as long as he needs developing in the twos, so that when, Lachie Neale moves on or Josh Dunkley maybe moves to a forward line and that space opens up, he's just going to absolutely explode because he'll be so ready and he won't have been exposed to it too early. The thing I was going to ask, I heard that someone say that if he was on their list, he would have played in their finals last year. And I thought that is so interesting because they said the same. I think Fagan said the same thing about Levi Ashcroft the year before that if he had been in the side, he probably would have been playing in their finals. So my question is, what hope do we have of anyone else winning the premiership this year?
Yeah, no one's getting anywhere near these guys, man. Like they were
it's crazy.
What did they beat Geelong by in the end? Like 10 goals?
Yeah.
It's just crazy.
And then you got McCluggage, who's just finally, really broken out as a midfielder as well, not just a wing guy. So, I think some may be put off by the fact that Annable, when are we going to see him? But I think at number one, it makes sense because, he might not have the instant impact, but in a few years when he's ready to go, he's going to be, one of the best fantasy players in the game.
Absolutely. And he is the most, of all of these guys that I've read out from a fantasy perspective, from being able to win the inside and outside ball, he's the most proven. You've got the stats there already in front of you that he can do it, and he can do it against VFL players as well, which is even more impressive. I think I am burnt by the fact that I sort of had the same expectation with Levi Ashcroft last year. I sort of said on a lot of these podcasts, like, it is going to be difficult for him to get into a team that's just won the premiership. And it was difficult for him right at the beginning. I think he was it was talked about that he was going to be sub or he was just going to miss the team early. And then they had a few late selection calls where someone was laid out and then he kind of got back into the team and then they play so well because they're such good footballers and you can't leave them out.
Yeah, his season surprised me too, actually, because I thought same thing. And that's why probably ultimately most ended up with Jagger Smith ahead of him. I'm sure there was that on their mind that they're going to see it sooner because Carlton were going to play him. Exactly. And Ashcroft would have to bide his time. But no, he's a premiership player with his brother. And, aren't the Lions flying? So that's unbelievable. That's your top 10. Love it. I love the names at start that just missed. I think there's plenty there, Dylan. I can't thank you enough for your in-depth explanation. And I think what you do really well is, using those player comparisons. It just helps so much. So I don't have a great knowledge of the juniors as they come through, but when you explain a player and their role and what they might be like, to then just use a player that we know very well, say, think that type of trajectory or player, I think it's really helpful. And I'm sure everyone listening has got a ton of info. I know I have. I'm feeling confident with my redrafts already just from having had this chat with you. So I thank you very much for making the first episode of Finders Keepers for season 2026 possibly the best. I'm not sure where we go from here, but no, I thank you greatly, mate. Let us know where can people find you on socials, across YouTube, because your analysis is fantastic and I'm sure many are going to want much more of it.
Thanks for the kind words, mate. I really appreciate that. And thanks to you for having me on. Really enjoyed it. This is my first appearance for the new year as well. So happy to be here. As far as where you can find me, I am on my major platform is YouTube for my draft content. You'll find everything on there, as well as Instagram under Dylan Alexander Follows Draft. We also do a live stream weekly I'm involved in at the True Footy YouTube channel with Jesse over there, where we do some more sort of mainstream AFL content. So we've got weekly live streams. We're going to be doing that, I think, most of the time from a Saturday to start the year and then a Monday as the year goes on. So that's kind of more of your general AFL content, and that we sort of, we mix in a bit of draft and off-season content into that as well. And that just kind of goes nicely with the draft content. I sort of like to be abreast of all of the AFL content as well. So it's kind of good to do both of those channels where one, you're sort of majorly focusing on the draft, and then the other one, you're majorly focusing on all the teams. And then you can kind of marry them up together with where you think, what teams need and where you think players could go based on that.
Awesome, mate. Go check him out on YouTube. And I think we might have to get you back for another episode later in the year and we can see how those rookies are going. Maybe we'll get you for a mid-season bit of a review and we'll look at your top 10 and how they're tracking. But
love
thanks
that,
again,
mate. Only get me on if it works out.
Yeah, we'll wait. We'll see how we go. Awesome, mate. Thanks so much. And that takes us to the end. It's a very big first episode, but my goodness, was there some Keeper League goodness in there. Absolute gems of information about this rookie class. And I think everyone who's listened to that is going to be well informed to attack the redrafts coming up. And speaking of coming up, we are on the ground for 2026 Finders Keepers. There's going to be a podcast episode every week in the build-up to opening round and the season proper. Next week on Finders Keepers will be the beginning of my rankings, starting with the defenders, where I'll be looking at who I think are likely to be available in your draft pools and who the best players would be to grab for your season this year and beyond. So thank you for joining us. I'm Jordox. This has been Finders Keepers. And until next time, keep on keeping on.